Hello and welcome to Long COVID Families Back to School Week 2022. My name is Megan Carmilani, and I am the president and founder of Long COVID Families. I am also a former secondary teacher, and I have post-viral syndromes similar to long COVID that are rooted in a childhood infection. So it is my greatest hope that this educational series provides relevant, supportive information to both families and educators. And together, we may create the community our children need to thrive during these unprecedented times. You may be aware that the conference was originally scheduled for August 8th. Several of our team members contracted COVID. They're doing okay now. But we had to make the hard decision to postpone the conference for 2 weeks to allow time to rest and recover. This also provided other team members time to put out the quality conference we have today without compromising their health. Radical rest and pacing are the keys to long COVID prevention. We will talk more about that during the conference. Let me tell you about the structure of the conference. It will take place over 4 days, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. There will be no presentations on Wednesday. We intentionally scheduled a midweek rest into the conference as we are a patient-led team and actively practicing pacing. Each day is separated into 2 sessions, morning and afternoon. Each presentation is recorded and will be available for viewing on demand after the conference. We will host live Q&A sessions throughout the week, which will not be recorded. Please see the agenda for details. Before we begin, I would like to offer some context around pediatric long COVID. There's a lot of discussion around what percentage of kids develop long COVID. It's the question I get asked the most. Some studies suggest 25% or more. And then there are studies that suggest the number is closer to 4%. The honest answer is we don't really know. The honest answer is every child is at risk, but we don't know how great that risk is. And we really can't predict which child will develop long COVID right now. All I can tell you is that it's happening. Children are developing long COVID, and it's serious when they do. Long COVID also is not rare. A rare disease is 1 in 200,000. But let's say it is 4% of children who develop long COVID after infection. Keep in mind, that's 4% of millions of kids. That's a lot of kids. Also consider polio disabled less than 1%. I also want to clarify that long COVID is an umbrella term originating from the patient community. It describes a host of symptoms and may look different depending on the child. Long COVID also is not an extension of acute COVID symptoms. While some people have symptoms during their acute infection phase that seem to continue for months, many kids are actually asymptomatic or have very mild symptoms initially, and then they go on to develop long COVID. Some don't notice their symptoms until maybe month 2. Others may experience a worsening of symptoms months 3 and 4, and in some cases, a child who was thought to have recovered from COVID only to be diagnosed with a complication related to COVID a year later. We are in the very early stages of research. There's a lot we don't know, which is why prevention is still so important. So this week, we will not only share information on long COVID, but we will share information on prevention and local advocacy. But first, we will focus on pediatric long COVID research, starting with a presentation from Liza Fisher. Thank you, and I'm glad you're here.
Liza Fisher is a board member and advocate for long COVID families. She received her MBA from Northern Kentucky University, and she's a certified yoga instructor. Liza is also a COVID long hauler, a citizen scientist, a health and wellness advocate with a focus on the BIPOC community. She's also involved in several long COVID research projects and organizations. Today, Liza is going to be discussing pediatric long COVID research.
Hello. Welcome to Long COVID Families presentation on what is long COVID, what the research is telling us. My name is Liza Fisher. First, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I got COVID in June of 2020, and I'm one of those people who just didn't get better. With a steep learning curve, I found very quickly that there wasn't a lot of research or resources at the time, and I needed to do some myself in order to advocate for my health care. In doing this, I learned to advocate for others, and that's part of the reason why I'm here to share my story. I also got involved in research as a patient, assisting with a research paper and co-author, and also patient-focused research programs and the NIH Recover Project. So what is long COVID? Well, as you can see, there are many definitions between the CDC, WHO, and NICE. There are differences. So we don't currently have a unified definition of what long COVID is. But overall, long COVID is a general term that covers physical and mental health symptoms some patients experience after COVID, apart from other conditions. Your child's doctor may recommend additional tests and possible referral to specialized multidisciplinary post-COVID-19 clinic. There are over 200 reported symptoms, and because of the constellation of symptoms, long COVID can vary from patient to patient, fluctuating in their frequency and severity. Continuing to look at what long COVID looks like according to the research, here are some of the main issues that are being reported. Things to note in the pediatric population: a multi-inflammatory system. It's a rare complication that typically happens 2 to 6 weeks after COVID infection, and symptoms of diabetes, which include frequent urination, increased thirst, increased hunger, weight loss, tiredness or fatigue, stomach pain, nausea, and vomiting. Those specific symptoms in relation to diabetes have all been reported in children and teens who have had long COVID. If your child tests positive for COVID, it's important to talk with your doctor about watching for lingering or new symptoms and what to do if you notice any. Please note that these symptoms can happen up to a year after infection. Your pediatrician can help you guide your child's safe return to activities such as school, sports, camp, jobs, and volunteer activities. Earlier this year, the CDC released a report which assessed 9 potential post-COVID signs and symptoms and 15 potential post-COVID conditions among over 700,000 U.S. children and adolescents. Some of the study's findings are consistent with previous evidence of elevated risk for new onset of diabetes, myocarditis, and certain symptoms, whereas other conditions like acute pulmonary embolism have not been previously reported post-COVID for adolescents and children. This is a wonderful display of how science, medicine, and time don't exactly line up always. Currently, science and medicine are fighting time, and the research is catching up. Recently in 2022, another study came out called Long COVID in Children and Adolescents, a systematic review and meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is essentially a study of studies. So all of the studies and reports that have been in electronic systems internationally were studied. So there are limitations within this. But after exclusion criteria, the number of patients included in the studies ranged from 53 to 57,000, and ages range from 0 to 18. A total of 80,071 children and adolescents with COVID-19 were included in this meta-analysis, which identified more than 40 long-term clinical manifestations associated with COVID-19 in literature reviewed. The symptoms that were presented in a single study and were unable to be incorporated in the analysis are orthostatic intolerance, cold hands and feet, chapped lips, fainting, twitching fingers and toes, and hallucinations. I say this because, interestingly, many of the symptoms identified in the meta-analysis associated to long COVID, such as mood, fatigue, sleep disorders, orthostatic intolerance, decreased concentration, confusion, memory loss, balance problems, exercise intolerance, blurred vision, body temperature dysregulation, dysfunctional heart rate variability, and palpitations. GI symptoms like constipation or diarrhea are all commonly present in dysautonomia. Dysautonomia is a dysfunction of the sympathetic and/or parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. Remember talking about how it was a multidisciplinary approach? Well, most of these symptoms are not commonly looked at together in research. So, if that's what the research is telling us so far, what are caregivers reporting? Long COVID families did a community survey in December of 2021, and we polled kids under 18 with long COVID. 34 families participated, of which 64.7% were stated to have an official long COVID diagnosis from their doctors. Other symptoms that only receive endorsement from one participant: PEM, post-exertional malaise, breathing difficulties, cough, stomach pain, and reoccurring fevers and insomnia.
I get emails and messages from people who are suffering from long COVID every day. Some of these stories are very emotional and devastating.
Feeling sick all the time, belly aches all the time, leg aches, and then I get headaches, like pains in my eyes. I don't feel like myself.
Here are some more symptoms that are not commonly talked about, but yet are still being reported in the patient community. Comments from parents have included descriptions of very alarming neuropsychiatrics. The increased reports of tics suggest that tics and other Tourette-like symptoms are a common feature of long COVID, and these features are also very similar to the condition known as pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcal infection. All of these symptoms and signs are messages from the body to listen to. Because there are multiple systems that affect each other, it's important to have a comprehensive view and approach. This is for the patient, caregivers and support system, and healthcare providers. Because, as this report, Children with Long COVID, states, it is becoming increasingly apparent that a large number of children with symptomatic and asymptomatic COVID-19 are experiencing long-term effects many months after initial infection. Caregivers are reporting children having difficulty in school, like reading, headaches, tired, upset stomach, irritability, rashes, which, if you're looking for signs, may sound like my head feels like it's on fire when I think, I don't want to go outside and play because it makes me tired, or it feels like bugs are crawling inside of me. Well, given that long COVID typically presents as a multi-system issue, meaning more than one body system is involved, a child may have a dysfunctional autonomic nervous system due to COVID. That's the dysautonomia we talked about before. The autonomic nervous system controls things that are supposed to happen automatically in our body, like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and digestion. It may seem like a child is listing random symptoms when in fact they are all related. An example would be complaints of stomach ache, dizziness, and feeling like they could breathe may all be due to a dysfunctional autonomic nervous system. After reviewing the definition of COVID, which isn't unified, in the plethora of symptoms, syndromes, and conditions which can occur post-COVID at a variety of intensity and onset, people are wondering what's causing long COVID. I'm wondering what's causing long COVID. Currently, in the research community, there are 5 hypotheses which are mostly acknowledged. First being organ damage from the initial virus. Second being microclots. Third, triggered autoimmunity, which is leading to other conditions like diabetes. Persistent virus or viral reservoir, which is lingering viral particles. And viral awakening or bacterial imbalance, also known as dysbiosis. Provided are links and references to research previously discussed and some research looking further into specific symptoms such as tics, the neuropsych symptoms, POTS, MECFS, diabetes, and general research. Please head to the link for Long COVID Families Research Database. Protective measures are essential to prevent long COVID in children. We need to understand the long COVID pathophysiology and symptomology to support clinical management systems, establish rehabilitation programs, and design guidelines in therapeutic research. This represents a significant public health concern, and there are no guidelines to address its diagnosis and management. The meta-analysis I referred to earlier supports the importance of continuously monitoring the impact of long COVID in children and adolescents and needs to include all variables and appropriate control cohorts in studies to better understand the real burden of pediatric long COVID. So, what do I do with all this information? Relating to my personal story, the knowledge that I gained empowered me to advocate for myself and for others. I am a person with long COVID. I am also continuing to live my life. So just because all of this information and the studies and the symptoms seem scary and overwhelming, life will continue. And coming together, we can amplify our voice for awareness, which to me leads to research, which leads to treatments. Where can I learn more? Well, head over to the Long COVID Families website, where you'll also find a list of pediatric clinics. If you're wanting to get involved in research, there are many ways, including some listed like Recover and Prevail Kids. Provided is an educational short documentary by Knowable Magazine, a nonprofit healthcare resource, in collaboration with Dr. Akiko Iwasaki. This resource reviews much of the information we covered and more that will be covered this week's conference. Things like what it is, patient stories, how to prevent it, and more.
We need to layer protective measures one on top of the other in order to reduce the risk of getting COVID so that we don't get long COVID either.
I feel sorry for you all the time. I want doctors and researchers to help find a cure for it, but I don't know if they can.
I think they can.
Jaime Seltzer is the Director of Scientific and Medical Outreach for MEAction. She is also a researcher for Stanford University and was the author of MEAction's Research Review. Jaime was the editor and consultant for Sundance award-winning health documentary Unrest. Today, Jaime will be discussing post-infectious illnesses.
Throughout the pandemic, including its stages so early that there was no name for long COVID yet, we spoke to NIH and CDC, urging them to speak and educate around the long-term consequences of viral infection. And researchers in the MECFS community projected that the number of people with MECFS would double or even triple due to SARS-CoV-2. And we're finding now that those estimates were likely optimistic. MEAction also created a series of resources in early 2020 for new adults and children who we knew would go on to be affected. So, as we've already said, long COVID may encompass a number of different diseases and disorders. These diseases are triggered, worsened, or even we might say unmasked by infection. That is to say, the patient might have had very minor symptoms and signs of these disorders for a long time, but not at a level that would have reached diagnostic significance. So, for instance, a child might have reported for a long time that they get dizzy when they stand up too quickly, but definitely they don't pass out or experience too much cognitive dysfunction from it. Well, perhaps they did have very mild POTS, but after infection, their symptoms may be much, much worse. We're going to focus on MECFS today because that is my area of expertise, but I wanted to touch on each of these other issues in post-viral patients. first of all, there is potential organ damage, and in SARS-CoV-2 particularly, there's microvascular damage as well. MCAS and MCS is mast cell activation. MCS is multiple chemical sensitivity. You see increased sensitivity and increased numbers of allergies in patients. PANS and PANDAS, we mentioned a little bit earlier. We used to believe that those were caused by one single pathogen, but in recent years, we've recognized that this disease can be initiated by a wide variety of different infections, just like pretty much everything on this board. And that includes some more blatant neuropsych symptoms and tics. POTS and other kinds of dysautonomia and orthostatic intolerance, when you change posture, like going from sitting down to standing up, you may notice that symptoms worsen. And then we have post-ICU syndrome, which is going to show up in patients that were severe enough to be hospitalized. So why would we not just go ahead and call it all long COVID? I think that it should continue to be called long COVID as well, because I think that people with long COVID, including children, have shared a relatively unique experience that's culturally important. I also think that being sure that you have POTS, for example, would connect you to the right doctors who know how to treat POTS, allow you to access the right treatments, and put you in contact with a disease community that shares your experiences alongside people with a long COVID community who share your onset experience and a lot of may have a lot in common with your onset story. Okay, let's move on to who gets ME/CFS after infection, what is onset of ME/CFS-like symptoms after SARS-CoV-2-like, and what are the chances of recovery. So ME/CFS, which is myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, is called a chronic complex disease. What that means that it has many symptoms in many different body systems, and that it has to be measured day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. It's classified as neurological by the World Health Organization, and there is a genetic susceptibility in conjunction with some kind of immunological trigger. This is the case in a lot of different diseases that are classified as neurological. We're finding that many diseases we did not know were triggered by an infection may be, such as multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, and Guillain-Barré. So most people with ME/CFS report their disease has been triggered by an infection. And in fact, there are now several studies that report that about half of people with ME/CFS about half of people with long COVID meet the ME/CFS diagnostic criteria. Even before SARS-CoV-2, people tended to think of ME/CFS as a disease of the modern age in some way, but there have been neurological syndromes after infection as long as modern medicine has existed. It's also not more prevalent in any particular country, and people of all races and genders and ages get it. And there are two peaks in diagnosis, which is a less well-known factoid, and I'll show you a graph in just a second on that. But there is a peak between age 10 and age 19, and a second peak that is mostly in the 30s. So a wide variety of different pathogens can initiate ME/CFS. It has been hypothesized that this means that it's the body's immune response to infection that initiates symptoms. While some individuals have a one and done trigger, a single infection after which they are never better, multi-hit onset is actually really common. And this is why avoiding reinfection with SARS-CoV-2 is so important. Repeated exposure to SARS-CoV-2 is leading to ME/CFS like long COVID at the second infection or the third infection. Insidious onset might be more common in kids and teens who have pre-existing POTS or hypermobility, according to Kathy Rowe, who helped write the pediatric primer for MECFS. People are noticing as well that their children seem to have a period of apparent recovery sometimes from the acute infection for up to several months before onset of long COVID symptoms. And I wanted to emphasize as well that the original infection does not have to be severe. It may even be asymptomatic and still lead to long-term symptoms. So here are our peaks of diagnosis, ages at diagnosis. This is from a large multi-center study in Norway. We see the surge that is often reported in people's 30s, but we have a pediatric spike from ages 10 to 19 for the most part. I wish everyone who's under the impression that children can't get these post-viral diseases would be able to see this chart. So total recovery in the first 1 to 2 years is relatively common. In adults, after that, recovery rate drops to about 5%. And that study that says so goes by a diagnostic criteria known to be associated with less severe disease in the first place. So that may be optimistic. However, children and adolescents are more likely to recover. Recovery may take years, though, not weeks or months. And it is very common that the patient improve, especially if they moderate their activity. Often children who begin showing signs and symptoms in that first spike that we discussed earlier, they may have a relapse at the second spike in their late 20s, early 30s. Unfortunately, we do see this pattern a great deal. So, signs and symptoms, what are we looking at when we see post-viral disease? First of all, this is from the 7-month study by PLRC, Patient-Led Research Collaborative, and just pointing out that we have a lot of symptoms in common, the most common one being post-exertional malaise. I heard earlier that that was not an often reported symptom. I think that that's really understandable. Most people don't know what post-exertional malaise is, and when asked to describe it to their doctor, they are reliant on description rather than a symptom name. However, this survey allowed post-exertional malaise as a response and explained what it was, and the vast majority of adult responders stated that they did have this symptom. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in greater detail in just a moment. So the very basic Institute of Medicine criteria for MECFS requires 4 symptoms. The post-exertional malaise that we mentioned, which is a worsening of symptoms and or the appearance of new symptoms after physical or cognitive exertion. Sometimes those symptoms are delayed from the trigger by 8, 24, or 48 hours, and patients may call this a crash. The fatigue requires the impairment to engage of the ability to engage in pre-illness levels of occupational, educational, social, or personal activities for more than 6 months. And the fatigue has to be persistent, profound, not lifelong, not the result of too much exertion, and not completely eliminated with rest. In addition, patients show unrefreshing sleep, and then they have to have cognitive impairments. This is the brain fog style symptoms we're discussing, and or orthostatic intolerance, dizziness, and worsened cognitive dysfunction when moving from sitting down to standing up, for example. A little bit more in depth with post-exertional malaise, it's important to recognize that although we talk about post-exertional malaise being triggered by physical activity, that cognitive overexertion and also sensory overload can likewise lead to worse than symptoms. This is important for the parent who isn't living through the disease to recognize this is not the same thing as feeling more tired than usual after your child is active. it's a unique symptom. Your child may describe it as feeling weighted down or as though they're wearing a coat of armor. They may, in the worst possible presentation, feel like they can't move at all. Um, Overdoing it may lead to days, weeks, or months to recover back to the previous baseline. When your child is in post-exertional malaise, you may notice that they have more difficulty speaking, reading, or communicating. They may be taking much longer to answer your questions or to reply because they're slowed processing time. They may tell you that they hurt all over or that their limbs, especially their extremities, are tingling or numb. They might have difficulty initiating movement, like we described. They might have flu-like symptoms like fever or swollen lymph glands. And they might also have reactive sensory sensitivity, as in bright lights are harder to deal with, loud sounds are harder to deal with, and so on. Now, if we really want to get to what symptoms look like, though, we have to go a little bit deeper and look at the older criteria that was built more to describe the disease rather than to diagnose it quickly. You may begin to see patterns that are a bit more familiar to you if you have been listening to your child describe these 200 symptoms. So this is the Canadian consensus criteria. It requires that illness be present for at least 6 months. 4 symptoms are required: pain of new origin, unrefreshing sleep. You may even notice that your child is wired at night, but very out of it during the day. Inversed sleep rhythm is not uncommon. Central fatigue, we say central as in it is not caused by physical activity. And we talked about PEM. These are all the foundational symptoms according to CCC, but there's more. We need at least 2 neurological or cognitive manifestations. Word retrieval was a big one for me personally. When I first got sick, I had struggled to figure out which word I wanted when, and there were long pauses in my speech. You may be able to note that in your child as well. This is one that isn't talked about enough: the perceptual and sensory issues, the disorientation, trouble focusing vision, spatial instability, reaching for something and not quite aiming correctly. All of these are signs that there's a neurological issue. Finally, we have a grab bag of symptoms from neuroendocrine, immune, and autonomic. You need at least 1 symptom from at least 2 of the categories here in purple. And there's a lot. Loss of thermostatic regulation. That means that it's very easy for you to feel too hot or too cold. Your baseline temperature might be low. Marked weight change, worsening of symptoms with stress. And then we have some of our gastrointestinal issues, cardiac arrhythmias, exertional dyspnea, which is shortness of breath. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what objective measures show up in post-viral disease. So one of the things that I thought was very interesting was that this is a pre-existing slide about MECFS. And I had to change almost nothing on this slide because all of these findings have been found in long COVID as well. One of the things that we do not tend to find in post-viral sequelae that was not initiated by SARS-CoV-2, but by some other virus, we don't tend to see as many issues with microclots and strokes. However, all the neuropsych issues have been replicated. The neuroinflammation issues have been found in both. Tilt table testing has shown cerebral hypoperfusion, which means the blood isn't getting to the brain, and so on. Even the small fiber neuropathy findings have been replicated. I should say natural killer cell assays, not yet, but I would be very surprised if that your natural killer cells, which are the white blood cells that help you fight viruses and cancer, don't work as well. It is a consequence of sleep issues. So now this is a particularly interesting study. A 2-day CPET is when you have 2 cardiopulmonary exercise tests that are 24 hours apart. People with the symptom of post-exertional malaise cannot report on day 2. This finding has been replicated in cardiopulmonary exercise tests in long COVID. And this is why repeated exercise doesn't necessarily improve symptoms in children and adults who experience post-exertional malaise. It's important to keep in mind that exercise like this is used to provoke symptoms in order to study them. Exercising will not make this happen less often. I'll also say that this is not really, you can't fool this test by not trying your hardest. It's measuring blood gases, and that cannot be faked. Now, this shows orthostatic intolerance in MECFS, and the same research group replicated this in long COVID. This shows that there's less blood flow to the brain when a patient goes from lying down to standing up. And this decreased blood flow was correlated to orthostatic and some cognitive symptoms. So the less blood flow there was, the more symptoms patients reported. You can find out a lot more about the different findings in MECFS in our research summary, including information on autoimmunity, metabolomics, which are changes in the way that carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are processed after disease, post-viral disease, I should say, and potential inflammation. There is possibly a hyperinflammatory picture at the beginning of the disease and a more immune exhaustion picture after the first 2 or 3 years. So if your child's symptoms are shifting now and they were one of the early onset folks, that might well be why. Okay, hopefully the moment you've all been waiting for, treatment and management strategies. So I'm going to bring up some things that are of clinical interest. Hopefully we're going to talk about some issues that you can help your child with more directly, and we're going to talk about some things that your school can do. So first of all, thinking about this disease as one thing may not be the best way to treat it. You have damage from the original infection, which may have led to lung damage or kidney damage or liver damage. You have the potential for viral persistence with SARS-CoV-2 or reactivation. We don't know for sure whether SARS-CoV-2 reactivates like the Epstein-Barr virus does, for example, but we do know that the stress of getting infected with SARS-CoV-2 can reactivate EBV. So all of these things are things to consider when you talk to a clinician about how you want this disease to be addressed in your child. And then finally, we have these metabolic, endocrine, and immunological shifts, which I might label MECFS. And we've got potentially a bunch of comorbid conditions, but that tends to be less true early in the disease. So strategies are to think about what issues are affecting your child most, and then focus on those issues. Once those issues are a little bit resolved, then you can bring the next set of issues to your clinician. We have noticed that medications can have unusual effects in this patient population. You want to start low and go slow. Even at child doses, you want to think about cutting those in half or quarters to start with, because there's some increased reactivity in this disease. Add one medication at a time unless the efficacy of one medication relies on the other. There's a feeling like we have to rush to get our child back to wellness, but it's going to be very hard to tell if your child has a negative response, which medication they were responding badly to, and then they may be unwilling to try again, because it's kind of like playing Russian roulette. And it's also important to know what's working. So if you take 3 pills and your child reports they feel great the next day, which one was it? And do you have to keep buying all of them? So it's important to do one at a time. If what we're looking at is something that's chronic, we're talking about something that's going to go on for more than 3 or 4 months. Medication should be considered at the gentlest medication that still does the job. And keep in mind that over the counter and diet and lifestyle changes can make a huge difference in chronic illness. And this is not the same thing as saying that the disease is not a serious one. Here are all of the different potential comorbidities and the potential treatments for them. Thank you to Dr. Jen Curtin at Rhythm Clinic who helped supply this slide. You may be dealing with sleep disorders, IBS, new allergies, and food intolerances. And so it is important to address each of these as its own individual thing that can help improve quality of life. Some people, since this is a disease that has a lot of neurological symptoms, some people have benefited from lower carbohydrate diet. However, this is not universal. So it's something to potentially give a try rather than something that everyone should always do. If your child is having trouble with certain foods, or they're having a lot of digestive issues, or they're having a lot of neurological issues or brain fog after they eat, it might be wise to try food intolerance testing. There are some frank vitamin and mineral deficiencies that are found in the wake of a severe infection. Those should be checked and supplemented as necessary. There is some evidence in MECFS that metabolism may be slowed overall, regardless of the activity level. So that's something to keep your eye on. And introducing the pacing guide, which we will have, we have a link to right there on the screen. You can take a screenshot if you would like. Pacing is a self-management strategy for activity that's meant to counteract post-exertional malaise or prevent post-exertional malaise. Patients who pace well are active when able and rest when tired, and they may plan extra rest ahead of strenuous activities. Pacing is a challenge and it's a big lifelong change. So it's important to work with your child and potentially with your doctor as well with the pacing guide. I would hope that that would be of help to you. It also has a number of school strategies and suggestions. Some other things that you can do to help your child are to buy them a smart device that will help them measure their heart rate or blood pressure. If you notice that your child tends to crash when their heart rate goes beyond a certain level, you can even program it to beep to remind them to slow down a little bit. Using diet diaries and symptom diaries, especially in the first year or two of illness, can really help your child and you plan to avoid PEM and to notice food sensitivities that might have developed. It might be that your child needs a mobility device. For sensory sensitivity, you might consider noise canceling headphones or dark glasses. And if you can find a support group for children who are sick, it's really important that they know that they're not alone in this. And then school accommodations like more time on assignments or fewer repetitious assignments. For example, if your child's math teacher tends to give drills, you can ask if your child can do every other problem or every third problem. After school help may be useful as well. So now this is more about you and your relationship with your child. It's important, despite the fact that your child may be feeling fatigued, to make room for activities that your child values, and to allow for different categories of activities: social, emotional, artistic, physical, educational. Within reason, it should be left up to the child what is important enough to spend their energy on. After good treatment and reasonable accommodations, feeling understood is the next most important thing. So try and be understanding of your child's limitations and recognize that most people are going to aim to do more than is safe for them rather than be lazy and do less. Acceptance that your child is sick is important for both you and your child. And this is going to be an unpopular thing to say, but there are meta-analyses in research that show that beyond giving new interventions an earnest try, attitude does not affect whether you're sick or well, and implying that your child will recover if they have a good enough attitude or enough willpower can really cause them harm. And you can get help with your child's IEP, which is their individualized education plan, by working with your school as necessary in order to allow them the accommodations that they need to be successful. Having a sick child is challenging for everyone in the house, including siblings and guardians. It all requires a period of adjustment. Probably one of the most challenging things is when to set boundaries and when to allow the child to push a little bit, and when it's time to stand up for or advocate for your child versus when it's time to step back and let them try. And if this sounds familiar, this is the eternal quest of parenthood, isn't it? It's just that introducing this additional complication makes things that much more challenging. Regarding mental health, in some children, mental health struggles will be directly related to their disease process. One mechanism, like reason why this is happening, is that neuroinflammation, for example, could contribute to depressive symptoms. This could mean that their mental health might worsen when other physical symptoms do. Other children may feel depressed and anxious because of the situation that they are in, and this is called secondary depression or secondary anxiety. And other children will not experience what we would term mental illness, even though they might experience transient distress. And they will learn to cope. It's very important that you, as the parent or guardian, can prepare yourself for all three of these potential outcomes in mental health. So, final remarks. Here's some contact information for me if you'd like to take a screenshot, and I'm going to scoot forward. So we have multiple resources, and I'll put links to those up, or I'll talk to long COVID families and make sure you can access the links. The pediatric pacing guide, which I showed you, there is a pediatric primer for ME/CFS that may be very useful in treating children with long COVID. Long COVID and ME/CFS, what's the connection, is a page that discusses why these two labels are associated with each other and includes a lot of resources in and of itself. The regular adult pacing guide, the research review, which we've already discussed, the hospitalization kit, which has what to take with you to the hospital and what to bring to your doctor. And there's the Living with ME support group, which is a group of people who share these symptoms and who are talking about the struggles that they're going through. Thank you very much. Don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A. And that is it from me.
Dr. Harlan Krumholz is a cardiologist and professor of medicine from Yale University. He's a director of the Yale New Haven Hospital Center for Outcomes, Research, and Evaluation. He's a leading expert in the science to evaluate and improve quality and efficiency of care, reduce disparities, improve integrity in medical research, and avoid wasteful practices. He is also named one of the top cited scientists in the National Academy of Medicine.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today, and thanks to Liza in particular for including me and letting me have a chance to join you. What I wanted to talk about, and I come to this with, let me say, great humility, because many of you have been managing this, working with this, engaged in this for a long time, and the community is remarkable. I mean, people who are affected by these conditions, either by a loved one or themselves, and yet they find the strength to move forward and to help each other and to provide peer support, information, and to try to make progress together, excuse me, while the rest of the world seemingly moves forward with, if anything, a bit of indifference or frustration or a sense of impotence about this. I know that most doctors, when put in a position of talking to a patient or a family about these issues, feels hopelessly inadequate unless they're a center of excellence that has honed their skills in what kind of information should they collect and has some sort of grounding in experience about how to manage these kind of things. And they're much more widespread, I believe, than has been widely known. And so in our midst, there's a driving need to address suffering among a large group of people. And it gets such short shrift in medical education and textbooks and research. And it's mostly because no one can understand it. No one understands the causes. The tests that are usually run are highly insensitive, meaning that they look normal in many cases, but people don't feel normal and their lives aren't normal. And they're facing situations that in every sense has unraveled their existence and placed them in a very different world than others are living in. And so, I've been, I guess, drawn to this for several reasons. One, I'm a cardiologist, and this hasn't been where my work has been, but with the onset of the pandemic, and because I have skills in research, I was sort of drawn to helping with COVID. And over time, I began to recognize that as COVID evolved, there was this big area of long COVID, and also there are these people who are reporting vaccine injury, and now, and children who are being affected by post-viral illnesses that's largely neglected. And I had the chance to sort of connect with Akiko Iwasaki. You saw a video of Akiko, who I think is just like the most remarkable investigator, someone who's got just such a great spirit about her, a brilliance to help investigate this, and an interest in reaching out to communities in ways that tend to be rare in the research arena. And we were able to forge a bit of a partnership around this, so that we could think about what the research could be that might help move us forward. And I think one of the things that was clear to me from the beginning was that there was a need for researchers to say out loud that this is a legitimate area of research, and that people who are suffering are authentically experiencing something that we don't understand, and we need to drive towards better tools for. And so this kind of awareness, this acknowledgement, I know this seems maybe seems silly to people who are in the midst of it, but I still hear people doubting the existence of this because their usual tests are not showing abnormalities, meaning that people come in, they get evaluated, and they don't see anything on imaging, they don't see anything on their usual testing. And so that leads to doubt. And I think it's important that there are researchers who are standing up and saying, we have no doubt. We have no doubt that people are suffering. We have no doubt that there's something important going on here. And we have no doubt that ultimately these post-infectious syndromes will be understood, and we'll be able to look back on this time as a time in which our understanding was so primitive. I think that we also need to be able to do research in a different way, in a way that is in true partnership, one that reaches out across expertise and recognize that people who are living with this illness or caring for children, in the case of families with this illness, have expertise that far outstrips clinicians and researchers. The understanding, the engagement in the day-to-day brings wisdom and experience and insight that you can only gain by being in that position. And so the only way that we're really going to be able to accelerate, I believe, the insight and understanding to build the tools for the diagnostics and therapeutics are going to be bridge the expertise from people who understand clinical research, people who understand lab research, and the people who are living with the disease. Otherwise, how do we even know that we're asking the right questions? I mean, I'm again, humbled by the presentations by people who know what it's like to live with it. So when you talk about symptoms, you sort of deeply understand what you're talking about in a way that's inaccessible to those who aren't living in that world. And so for us to be able to make progress forward, the idea is that, yeah, we need the funding and we need the people, the researchers, but in isolation, I don't think that we'll make the kind of progress that we can unless we're holding hands and moving forward together in a very collaborative way, in a way that's not hierarchical, where there's researchers up top and subjects on the bottom. We dispense with the word subjects. It's about participants and teammates and working together. And we researchers still aren't doing it well enough. We aren't doing it well enough, but we have to be committed to continue to learn, take feedback, and figure out how we can do it better. And then then also by working together collaboratively, that sense of urgency is something that's ever present, because you're talking to people who are suffering in the moment. And, Kiko and I, we get communications all the time from people, and it brings in bright relief the necessity to continue to work as hard as we can and as fast as we can. And then there's this other part, which is I believe that we need to be able to have a sensibility about this, where each person is contributing knowledge that can both either help them or the person who follows them, that we don't waste experience. And that means that we're in a position where we say, we need to learn from each person affected. We need to get each person within a learning network. We need to be able to move quickly such that we don't waste experience. Whatever's happening to people, we need to be able to make it not a burden, but easy to be able to track their journeys, their experiences, what's gone well and what hasn't, and be able to cull the insights from the entire group in ways that I think has been unusual within research for it. And then when there are things to test, when there are trials, when there's new opportunities, people are poised. It doesn't take us 2 years to enroll a whole group of people, because we have a big community of people who are primed for research, a readiness group that's eager. They want their stories to be told. That helps raise awareness. So on the qualitative side, they want their clinical research journeys to yield insight if it can. And they want to be able to combine with the basic scientists who are working in labs on basic immunology like Akiko, to be able to forge that forward and to have bidirectional communication, so that as soon as new knowledge is available, it's able to be transmitted. And then it can be applied when appropriate in ways that might not, again, lead to a lag from the time that new things and help arrives, and that help is able to be translated into the actual care of individuals. And then, of course, when we're dealing with children, there's all sorts of additional complications. We have to be very careful around the security of data. We have to be thoughtful about how studies are organized. We have to be reluctant to impose any sort of harms or burdens on them. Every blood draw, every single test with a child is not easy. It's not easy. So we have to be thoughtful about how do we get the most out of every single study that's done. When studies done in the course of clinical care, how do we make sure those are archived and used for research? Because that's already been done. That's being done for clinical care. So let's see if we can leverage those things to the best extent possible. And when there's new protocolized data collections that need to take place, let's make sure that they're as convenient and as non-traumatic as can possibly be, and convinced that they're worth it, so that, as many smart people as possible can work on this stuff. That's another principle, which is how do we make it so that it's not like single researchers sequestering data, like it's my data and my subjects, but that we're actually all in a race against the disease. And that what we're trying to do is figure out how do we make data available to every smart person, securing the privacy, making sure that people's identities are protected, making sure particularly children, are in a heightened sense of making sure that their information doesn't flow around freely. But if we can de-identify and organize it, or create it within what we call, computational sandboxes, protected areas, and then we want as many smart people as possible working on this. So we don't want the data in the end to be the constraint. We only constraint should be ideas. Can we come up with enough good ideas to try? And then how do we learn systematically? Because again, people are trying all sorts of different things, and some things are expensive, some things are dangerous, but people are desperate. And so we need to be able to call, again, the experience that's going on out there. So anyway, this was just a few minutes to share some ideas that, deep respect for this community, deep heartbreak for what people are largely experiencing and the suffering that's persisting. But maybe, we're at a turning point where we can begin to galvanize the community in ways that we say we need to learn from each person. We need to learn from each person's journey, and we need to be able to pair it with how do we systematically and unobtrusively, non-burden, collect and organize data, and how do we get as many smart people as possible working on these problems? How do we get the funding lined up? How do we get the advocacy such that that people are talking about this. And in this way, long COVID may be an opportunity because it's a sad opportunity, but an opportunity nonetheless, because so many people are affected that maybe people won't be able to be indifferent about it. They won't be able to turn away from it. They won't be able to say, don't understand, don't know what to do about it, got to keep going on other things, but rather turn toward it because it's such a big issue in society. And then maybe this will unlock many of the similar issues, syndromes that exist that have also caused so much suffering over the years, but for which the progress has been slow. And I'll just say, one other thing is that I think that it's sort of like, in baseball where there's a fly ball and three people surround it and it falls to the infield because nobody claimed it. That, it's not clear where where this sits within medicine. And the reason is because the manifestations are so what we would call protean. They're so broad-based, they fit so many different fields. So it's up to us to make sure that because no one owns it in medicine, that it doesn't fall through the cracks, that in fact, and there are lots of people, I want to say this with respect for all the researchers who have been working on it and all the people in the community who have been engaged. There are lots. So I'm not saying that, but I do think that we would benefit from having more, And maybe it's that, industry also needs to see this as an unmet need. And I hate to say it, but within the US, they have to see it as an opportunity, a business opportunity to get into this. I mean, we need funds flowing from all sorts of different directions, smart people, and in partnership with those who are suffering. So anyway, thank you so much for the opportunity. I just wanted the chance to share some of these thoughts, the work that Akiko and I are doing. Others also are working on these problems, but we have a study called Project Listen. You could look Listen Study at yale.edu and email us, or you can just Google it and find out more about it. But we're trying to build up a large number of people who are affected, trying to build a sense of community, not hierarchical, but partnership, and see if we can generate insights from data that will help relieve suffering. And that's sort of the central goal of the effort. But thanks very much. Glad to answer any questions or stay around for the question and answer session. Thank you, Liza.
Dr. Melissa Ramirez is a school psychologist. Her primary career focus is on advocating for marginalized students, with a focus on equity, diversity, and inclusive practices. Today, she's going to be speaking about the impact of long COVID on learning. But first, we're going to hear from two young long haulers, Nick and Hannah.
Hello, my name is Nick, and before I got long COVID, I was in marching band. I was also part of the school swim team, and I was a very smart child. I was in AP courses every year of high school, except for this most previous one. And I had straight A's in all my classes because, it was important to me that I do well. And, so after I got COVID and subsequently long COVID, it was very rough for me to go to school and stuff. Like, my classes, online classes, they weren't too terrible, but it was kind of hard to focus, especially when you can't really ask for a one-on-one because you miss something. And there were recorded and you could go back and watch them, but there's not much you could really do unless you went into school for some one-on-one tutoring. And then when we transitioned into in-person school my senior year, it was very hard for me to attend because, I had a giant backpack with stuff with AP textbooks, and my classes, they were all on the 3rd floor, and I didn't realize that we had access to the elevators well, we didn't, but if you went to the office and bought a key, then you could use the elevators, but I figured that was only for people with broken limbs or whatever. Yeah, so a lot of the time, most days, I was absent because I just felt terrible. I couldn't get up, and I couldn't take a shower. It was so hard to take a shower and be presentable, and because the heat from it would just cause me to react, and so after 3 weeks of absences, I went to my counselor, and I talked with my teachers, and we were like, hey, what can we do about this? And there was an option for it's called homebound, but since COVID, they haven't actually been able to do homebound. You still have to go somewhere. So I had to go to the public library to try and get caught back up on many, many weeks of instruction and work that I had missed. So we decided that it would probably be better just to, even though it really hurt my ego to do it, it was better to just give up and graduate early. And I feel like the main thing that could have helped is just offering virtual, because even though virtual wasn't great, it was still far better than what I experienced my senior year. And I hate that I couldn't perform the way that I wanted to my senior year, because if I could have finished the 2 APs I took, then I probably would have been top of my class for GPA. But unfortunately, that was not in the cards. Well, that's my experience. I hope this helped.
My name is Anna. I am 10 years old and I have long COVID. Before I was sick, I played soccer and I took art classes for learning to draw cartoons. I love to read and play video games. My favorite book is Harry Potter, and I have read the whole series. Since I have been sick, I've had to take a break from most of the things that I like to do. Some things I have learned how to do differently, like drawing on the iPad, because it takes less energy and doesn't hurt my hand. I used to be really good at school, but since getting sick, I have had a really hard time. The school has tried to help me with a tutor, but me and my parents would like to know if there's any other things my school can do to make it easier. Reading is one of my biggest problems because all of my classes have stuff for me to read. I'm just a lot slower reader than I used to be, and I lose my place a lot. I learned to use my finger below what I'm reading to help me keep my spot. I feel like even once I get through what I'm reading and answer the question, I don't remember as much as it as I should have, and I hate it. I wasn't able to do school in person for 4 months after being sick, but went back for a half days before we let out for the year. It was very difficult to pay attention in class. I had to take a lot of breaks. The loudness at the hallway and the lunchroom was very overwhelming. Assemblies were horrible. Not only does the sound make me very uncomfortable, but I am scared of getting COVID again, what it will do to me. I wear a mask, but most other kids were not by the end of the year. And when I have to take off mine to eat or drink, I feel like I'm asking to get sicker. I feel like my teachers don't really understand when I ask for help or to do something differently because I look totally normal and they can't tell how I feel.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Back to School in 2022. I'm Dr. Melissa Ramirez. I'm a local school psychologist in Western Pennsylvania. I am honored to be here today to talk to you about long COVID and its impacts on learning. But what we also know is just not impacts on learning, but it's also impacts on the whole child, academically, social, emotional, and behaviorally. And so those are going to be some critical pieces that we talk about today as we talk about advocating for our students. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk the talk. I want you to know how to advocate for your child with what I'm going to refer to as post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection, or PASC. And then I want us to think about the whole child, social, emotional, academic, behavioral well-being, and what does that mean in the school setting? So like I said, I'm Dr. Melissa Ramirez. I'm a nationally certified school psychologist. I have been practicing school psychologist mostly at the secondary level, so for grades 7 through 12, at a local district in Western Pennsylvania. I am a passionate advocate for families and for children. And I just love meeting your little ones, and I just love supporting everything about them in the school setting. And I am honored to be here today to continue to support you in any way that I can. So let's talk long COVID impacts on learning, or what I call PASC. So here's what we know. We want to talk teams. And teams is so easy to say, but it's not always easy to do. But that's exactly what we need to do when we're thinking about our approach to PASC. So why am I calling it PASC? Because the National Institute of Health recently started using the term post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection. And we really, as a committee of psychologists, of school psychologists, really believe that this is an important takeaway because we think it really accurately describes the symptoms and complications experienced after the virus is no longer detected. And I think that's an important thing because we understand that can be so difficult for families and so difficult for students to navigate. And, you know, from my perspective, in particular for students at that secondary level, because now we're talking about credits and graduation and college and post-secondary life. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we can navigate that to have to lessen the impact on the whole child. So here's what we know. Research is absolutely evolving. And although there's limited data, the research is telling us that this PASC, or post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection, really, really resembles a sustained concussion presentation in students. And that is something that we're all familiar with, that post-concussion protocol. And what symptoms do we see? You know, in the classroom, we see fatigue, sleeping, head down, headaches, constant nurse visits, feeling fogged, not able to recall information either long-term or short-term, right? So that memory impairment. And that can be so startling and disheartening to somebody who has been generally able to participate up to this point. It's confusing. It makes you feel isolated, and it can start to exacerbate some of that mental health that we see. So what can you do as the parent, as a fellow educator, as a fellow clinician? You got to find your team. The team approach is going to be so critical to sort of wrapping our arms around our individuals or our students related to PASC. So who is your team? Your school psychologist is your number one go-to. And I say that, and I'm not biased, but generally speaking, we're the ones who are supporting or facilitating multi-tiered systems of supports or interventions for children. We're the 504 coordinator, and we sit on almost every IEP team. So, you know, really seek out that school psychologist, but also any administrator. So your assistant principals or your principals, your MTSS coordinators, your school counselors, or your nurses. That's your team. And what do you do once you find your team? You got to find somebody who's going to hear you. And that's why I say reach out to that school psychologist or your professional school counselor, because they've got that that professional niche, right? Where they can really start to dig in and do some observations and talk to the student about how we can best support. But one of the next steps that's so critical, and sometimes, this is a very easily overlooked step. Share your medical documentation with the educational team so we can talk. The best realm of supports for a student is that full circle approach. So everybody's talking the talk and everybody's walking the walk. If we are not speaking the same language, how can we possibly think that that student, your child, is going to progress and get better in that educational setting? It's so critical that the medical team and the educational team has time to meet, collaborate, consult with each other. And of course, that includes the parents, right? That educational team is you, is us. We're hand in hand together, making sure that your child gets the best level of education that they can. And it's about leveling that playing field to make sure that they can access their education just like their general ed peers. And we'll talk a little bit about what I'm referring to in terms of accessing, equalizing, right? You also want to talk about educational expectations in advance. So we've got COVID. We are now diagnosed with long haul COVID, or PASC, right? And so we're thinking about a return to the building or a return to some form of learning, whether it be in person or online. How do we think about supporting that child? Everything needs to be planned in advance, and flexibly thinking is going to be a really critical piece. So what do I mean about planning in advance? I'm talking about meeting with the educational team and the medical team and talking about what accommodations and what types of supports are going to be needed. Do we need to talk about elevator use? Do we need to talk about a tapered day, right? So maybe not so much starting a full day, but maybe there's a couple of classes that we're going to start with, whether it starts the day or ends the day, because we got to be mindful. Each individual is going to be impacted in a different way. Much like our post-concussion folks, our PASC folks are going to present themselves with heavy fatigue, right? So if we ask them to come to a full day of school and they can't make it, we've already set them up for failure. So we have to be cognizant and mindful of the steps that we're taking. So I encourage you to sit around that table and really think about what your child may need. And maybe we're talking about returning to some virtual learning. And again, virtual learning, when I think about that, and it's maybe not so much the physical stamina, but the mental stamina of being able to continue to focus on a screen and go between tabs and do all, it is tiring. You only have so much reserve in your tank, per se, related to, your ability to sustain and move forward. And so we've got to be really mindful of that. So thinking about the academic accommodations, what the day looks like, do we need physical adaptations? So like I had mentioned when I first started, an elevator key. Can the classes be moved to the first floor and not the second floor? Can you enter in a closer door? All of those things should be talked about. And I really want you to be clear walking away from this, knowing that the progression is nonlinear. You gotta be prepared for setbacks, and that's okay. As long as we're all flexibly thinking and pivoting to the needs of the individual in front of us, we're gonna make a successful team and we're going to make progress. We don't expect students to return and be 100% capable of what they were able to do prior, right? And again, it's all based on baseline. So I'm not going to be asking somebody to come back and do 200%, right? So you just really have to keep thinking about how we can keep the pace and keep the education moving while filling in those gaps. Flexible thinking. I can't stress that enough. And that's just what the term that keeps coming to mind. I really want us to just be able to sit and brainstorm and be okay that we might have to go back from 5 periods to 4 periods. That's okay, because the end game is always going to be the same: progression. What can I ask for from this COVID team leader, or this school psychologist, or your professional school counselor, right? What you want is these accommodations up front that can gradually taper out as we see success. And success is not on a timeline. It's not like I mentioned, it's a nonlinear progression, right? So it is however long it takes that individual to get back to their prior baseline. And so, what are some of those academic and environmental accommodations that we could see in maybe a PASC 504? Because really that's what we're going to be talking about, right? And I mentioned this a little bit before, is leveling that playing field. So when we level that a playing field, we provide accommodations, both academic and environmental, that level the field so we can all access our education in the same way. What we're really talking about is equity. So, flexible attendance, understanding that there are times that you may have to resort to in-person virtual learning versus in-person learning, or you may be off that day, and there may be a day where you can't make it to school. And so getting that team set and ready so we can get your work ready in some like in an accommodated faction. Thinking about physical education. So, yes, gym is a requirement, but gym is also a flexible time to be able to think about it differently. Maybe part of your treatment plan is to do some mild yoga and stretching. Can the team consider those types of activities your gym requirement versus the typical let's go out and play pickleball? Your tank, like I talked about earlier, may not be full enough, right? And we gotta really divvy out and make sure that we're not focused on the wrong thing. And so maybe having some accommodations related to physical education, or utilizing the elevator, having all of our classes on the first floor, those types of things. I call them a preferred schedule. So you've got like a course, and then you've got, say, a progress period where you can take a breather, and then you've got a course, and then you've got a period where you can take a breather, more built-in study halls, more built-in brain breaks, more built-in time to really be able to focus on what you need to focus on and allow your body and your brain and your heart to heal during those interim downtimes. I think some of the other things that we really want to talk about is modifying the workload, streamlining work. So non-essential written work is reduced. Non-essential or repetitive types of activities are reduced. Utilizing technology. Technology is our friend. So can we use a software that, is a speech to text or a text to speech, where it reads to us and we can take a break and close our eyes while we listen to the content. Hall passes for when we can transition when it's a non-crowded time. Being allowed to be late. Couple minutes late or a couple minutes early leaving from class goes a long way for student success. We talked about flexible attendance, understanding that attention, concentration is going to be hindered. And so what are we going to do? What strategies can we put in place to make sure that we are supporting that student? And so again, right, helping with organization, giving organization time, allowing things to be turned in a day or two late, right? Small group setting for testing. All of those things really will model good prevention strategies for our students. And in all of this, whether it's related to PASC, whether it's related to post-concussion protocols, whether it's related to just people experiencing COVID-19 in its entirety, we have to monitor our emotional well-being. That is so critical. Now we have experienced not only COVID-19 as a a pandemic, but we've experienced this mental health crisis. And I am so happy to be sitting here today to be able to share a link with you for the 988 crisis hotline. For any behavioral or mental health crisis, you're able to call anywhere at any time and get the help that you absolutely need. But what are we doing at the school setting? We're monitoring for any change in behavior. Any psychologist will tell you, we're looking for in 2 weeks, what was the frequency, intensity, and duration? And is that way different than your typical baseline? Yeah, you might spend some time as a teenager in your bedroom. Has it gotten longer? Are you not coming out? Are you not eating with us anymore? Are you spending most of your day, kind of hiding in a dark room or not at home and you feel like they're trying to escape? Those are all factors. Frequency, intensity, and duration over a 2-week period is really going to tell you something's not right. And if your gut is telling you something's off, let's get a screening. Let's approach the school and say, hey, we're noticing a behavior change. That's the first place you're going to see it, right? In the behavior. And then you can always ask the question, how are you feeling today? Have you been feeling like this a lot lately? On a 1 out of 10, talk to me about where you're at in terms of the feeling that you just described. And, I think always being able to ask and beg the question of, are you feeling suicidal? Are you feeling like you want to kill yourself? Those are important questions when we get down to thinking about monitoring someone's emotional well-being. Utilizing all of your resources, both at the school level and then in your community, is going to be critical. So your 988 crisis line, doing that monitoring, parents, us going, okay, I'm noticing a behavior change. What's the frequency, intensity, and duration? And being open about having the conversation. That's the first thing that you can do. You're never going to put that idea into somebody's mind. What you are doing is giving them a door to walk through and relieving them of some of that stress. Because I got to tell you, from PASC to post-concussion to COVID to life, it's heavy. And we need to be able to talk to our children, our teens, and our adults, and our friends and our neighbors about how they really feel. So destigmatize that mental health piece for a minute and really be able to support. So I said a lot of things, and really what I want you to take away from here is a bunch of resources that really speak to what can we do to continue to support our students in the educational setting. I talked about the chapter 15, section 504, which is leveling that playing field and utilizing a medical diagnosis to really that has a large, substantial impact on somebody's one of your essential living factors. Learning is one of them. And being able to provide them with a document that really is able to provide those in-depth accommodations that are individualized for that student. Utilizing that 988 crisis line when somebody or yourself is having a behavioral or a mental health crisis. You can speak to somebody immediately. Having that number in your back pocket is crucial. And just the periodical related to PASC from our National Association of School Psychologists is so critical because it talks through almost everything that I've talked about today and some best practice approach for all people. I want to thank you for listening today, and I want to thank you for taking your time to learn more about how to support and advocate for maybe a family member, somebody in your own household, an immediate family member, or for yourself. And please know that I am always here for you to reach out to, just to either have a listening ear, lend a listening ear, or a helping hand. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Gretchen Kelly is a writer and board member with Long COVID Families. She is an advocate and also writes with the People's CDC. Diagnosed with ME/CFS in 2004, she's also the parent of a child with chronic Lyme. Her advocacy work and writing is focused on equity in healthcare and research and centering patients' voices. Today she's going to be discussing How to Track Children's Long COVID Symptoms. But first, we're going to hear from Megan Carmilani as she shares her personal story about the challenges of symptom tracking.
So my name is Megan Carmilani. I am the founder and president of Long COVID Families. We are a nonprofit that supports children and caregivers with long COVID. I am here today to talk to you about impediments to care specific to the pediatric community. I do not have long COVID myself. However, I do have post-viral syndromes that are anchored in an infection I had as a child, leaving me with symptoms almost identical to many children with long COVID, symptoms I still have today. It took me almost 30 years to receive an appropriate diagnosis and medical care. I do not want that for any other child, which is why I'm here today. Unfortunately, the barriers to medical care I experienced as a child are still present. Long COVID is an invisible illness for the most part. Standard medical tests do not tell us much. Therefore, the primary source of information is the patient themselves. This means the patient's ability to articulate the internal workings of their body is essential for treatment. This puts children at a disadvantage as they typically do not have the language of illness, or they are pre-verbal, and some are nonverbal. They usually do not know how to interpret these strange new body sensations. For example, I was first diagnosed with mono when I was 11, after which I had a sensation in my chest that I struggled to describe. I repeatedly told adults I can't breathe, and I was told it was anxiety. So I stopped telling anyone what I was experiencing. I continued to have that sensation in my chest to this very day. Turns out that sensation is tachycardia, which I learned when I was 39. Kids with long COVID often describe tachycardia in the same way. They will say, I can't breathe. Other things kids have said, my throat hurts, when they mean their necks. They'll say, I can't think, when describing cognitive dysfunction, or sometimes they'll say their head hurts when they mean they're struggling to process new information. One of the hallmark symptoms of post-viral illness, including long COVID, is fatigue, which is also one of the hardest symptoms to identify in vocabulary. They might say they're tired or they don't want to do something. It can be as confusing to the child as the parent. And typically it's contributed to lifestyle, such as sleep or diet. In addition, children struggle to communicate the impact of fatigue on their daily lives. This is because they lack the lived experience to have a clear sense of before and after, which is what many adults rely on to explain debilitating fatigue. For instance, you may hear an adult say, I used to be able to work a 12-hour shift, and now I struggle going to the grocery store. What's interesting is that we've noticed that athletes seem to be diagnosed quicker than the average child. And that may be because the symptoms are easier to identify. As one teenager said, I used to run the stairs at school, and now I can't even walk 3 steps without feeling like I need to sit down. So there's a clear before and after that can be observed by adults. The observation of symptoms by adults is vital when it comes to recognizing long COVID in kids. They need an adult to truly see their struggle. If that doesn't happen, then that is an insurmountable obstacle to medical care. Kids can't take themselves to the doctor. It will often take a caregiver more than 6 months, often 9 months, to recognize long COVID. Sometimes it's taken more than a year, which begs the question, how many kids are we missing? Once a caregiver recognizes the symptoms, there's yet another obstacle. The caregiver has to explain it to the doctor in a way the doctor can receive. Parents will often say things like, my child is just not behaving like himself, or my child spends all her time in her room. This is not enough information in a 15-minute office visit for the doctor to figure out it's long COVID. Additionally, even if the parent clearly explains the child's symptoms. Diagnosis still requires the doctor to be knowledgeable enough about long COVID and post-viral illness to recognize the pattern of symptoms to inform proper course of action. I want to go back to my story for a moment to demonstrate how easily these symptoms can be missed. Again, I was 11 when I was diagnosed with mono. Months later, I noticed I couldn't run as fast in soccer, and I often felt lightheaded and dizzy. I was told I was dehydrated. I would nap after every game. I was told that was because I was growing. Soon after, I quit soccer, unable to keep up with my peers. My parents thought I had just lost interest. I now know those were symptoms of POTS, which is a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, and post-exertion malaise, one of the hallmarks of ME. I had serious digestive issues. I was told IBS and hormones were to blame. At 39, those symptoms finally resolved after I started taking medication used for mast cell activation syndrome. I had pain in my legs. I was told that was due to growing pains. I now know this is a common way for kids to express fatigue or even blood pooling in the legs, which is a symptom of POTS caused by blood vessels not constricting properly. So you can see how easy it is to miss these significant symptoms. As a child, I had no other choice but to push through. I progressively got worse over the years. By the time I was in my 30s, I was no longer able to work, and I spent 3 years essentially bedbound. Countless doctors were unable to help until I met one who had a significantly different approach. More tests were run, and once again, results were within normal range. I expected the doctor to say there was nothing else we can do, as all the others had. Instead, this doctor pulled up a chair and asked me a series of questions. When, where, how do you experience your symptoms? There was something in my answer that made her eyes light up. She grabbed a piece of paper, wrote down instructions for me to record my blood pressure and my heart rate. She handed me the paper, told me to buy a blood pressure cuff, and come back in a week with my heart rate and blood pressure numbers. Without fully explaining, she was directing me to do what is known as the NASA 10-minute lean test. A week later, I brought my numbers in. They were all over the place. She looked over the paper and announced, well, it looks like you have POTS, which was a medical condition I had never heard of. I was then referred to a dysautonomia clinic for further testing and encountered another doctor with a unique approach. After the doctor introduced himself to me, he took out a pad of paper and he said, tell me about your symptoms. Start with the first time you noticed them or that something was off. And then he listened intently as I told my story, beginning when I was 11. He asked me questions in an effort to identify a pattern. Within the week, I had multiple new diagnoses, new symptom management strategies, and medication. Within a month, I was able to get out of bed most days. It was like someone flipped a switch. That was only 4 years ago. I am still disabled, but treatment took away my suffering. I take the lessons I learned from those two doctors and I share it with the caregivers today. The context of the symptoms matter. The frequency, the severity, and duration. In order to capture this information, I suggest that caregivers develop scientific observational skills, which is to observe using the 5 senses and document those observations. For instance, what do you see when you look at your child's skin? What do you see when you observe them doing homework or eating, when they are sitting, standing, walking, climbing stairs? What do you notice about your child's sense of sight, sense of smell, sense of taste? I suggest caregivers document these observations over the course of 3 weeks and bring these observations to the doctor. And for parents who have tried this, it's been a very successful strategy. So that's what we can do as caregivers to help children with long COVID. We can truly see them. What pediatricians can do is to understand that long COVID in kids typically shows up as syndromes, which means the pattern of symptoms is important. It's also important for the doctor to look at co-occurring symptoms and to know symptoms are typically waning and reoccurring. We need doctors who are familiar with common comorbid post-viral syndromes and are able to identify the evidence of illness in a patient's story. In addition, we need doctors to be open to noticing new patterns that might be unique to long COVID. And finally, we are seeing organ damage in some children post-COVID that is not apparent on standard testing. For instance, some of our children have lung damage that only showed up on SPECT imaging. All of these children were initially told that they had exercise-induced asthma, and it took more than a year of reporting symptoms for lung damage to be found. We have also heard reports in our patient forum of liver, heart, and kidney damage. I have no way of knowing how often this happens or if COVID is fully or partially to blame. I simply know it's happening, and we need to look into it.
Hi, my name is Gretchen Kelly. I am a mom of 3, and I'm a member of Long COVID Families. I am here today to talk to you about symptom tracking. First, I want to give a little background about myself and my daughter. About 6 years ago, my teenage daughter started presenting with some strange, vague symptoms that basically left us perplexed. The doctors weren't sure what was wrong. Initially, we thought it was anxiety or depression, but it definitely seemed like more than that. 6 years later, we have a diagnosis. She has a post-infectious illness. We are still in the process of treating it. But the reason I want to talk to you today is I want to talk to you about tracking symptoms. This is a really important part of managing your child's illness, figuring out what's wrong, figuring out if there is in fact an illness, if it is, it can help you rule in or rule out anything that may be going on. And it's also a really good tool for you to have to show to your doctor. This is going to provide them with information. It's going to help them. When you go to the doctor with your child, they have maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. They're under a time constraint. The more information you can give them, the better. So that's what we're going to do today. First, I'm going to kind of just give a little brief background about what we went through with my daughter without getting too specific. She started presenting with vague symptoms. This was a well-behaved child, excellent student. It took us about 4 years to get a diagnosis, which is actually fairly quick in the post-infectious world. So in that respect, we were lucky. If I had known then what I know now, I would have tracked her symptoms. I would have had a method and a process of doing it instead of just feeling like I was floundering. As a parent, when your child's going through this, it is overwhelming. It is scary. It's stressful. It's emotional. It's everything, all of that. And it can make it really hard to be objective and to have a sense of what's truly happening. So what I'm going to talk about is how to track your child's symptoms in a way that is scientific, that's objective, that removes the emotion. So the way that we are going to track symptoms, I'm going to kind of just walk you through a somewhat hypothetical, kind of a day in the life of what we went through with my daughter, to give you some specific examples and kind of demonstrate how you can do this. It can be as simple as you want it to be. The way I do it is I just get a notebook. If you want to make a spreadsheet, you can. If you want to do notes on your iPhone notes, you can. I just do a notebook. And what I do is I write out their basic schedule for the day, the time to wake up, if they eat breakfast and what they eat for breakfast, go into school. Did they stay at school the whole day? Did you have to pick them up? Just basically the basic routine of the day. And then I have a section where I write down symptoms. And what we do here is we write down the basic symptoms: fatigue, headache, nausea, if their heart's racing, whatever their symptoms are, you put them there. And then I use a 0 to 10 scale, one that's based on functionality. So for example, their fatigue would be measured. Were they able to go about their tasks? Were they able to go to school? Were they fatigued but still able to function? If so, that's going to be a lower number. If they were so fatigued they could not get out of bed, then that's going to be a 10. So that's how I rate it. I put a number next to each symptom to rate how severe that symptom was. That's really important to know. Fatigue can be a misleading word to some people. And so we want to make sure that we are demonstrating how this is impacting the child's daily activity and how it's impacting their life. So that number is really important. And on our website, we are going to have just a really simple symptom tracker that you can download. And we're also going to have those number scales that you can have for reference. You can save them in your phone, you can print them out, but that way you can see, you can have that to refer to this, and you can even ask your child, do you feel like you can get out of bed today? You can use that also to kind of ask your child questions, especially when they're younger. It can be harder to get these specifics. And then what I also add, I do this 1 page per day. I just write notes. I write down anything that I observed that day. How was their mood? You can go into a little bit more detail here, like they fell asleep on the way to school, which is not exactly normal, but it's worth noting. And we're going to approach this like a scientific observation, like a field journal. When you were in science class in middle school, and you would have to go observe, something in nature, you would have your journal and you would just write down objective observations. What did the organism do today? How did it appear? What changes were there? So that's kind of what we're doing here. So I'm going to just kind of walk you through a few days so you can kind of get an idea of how we do it. We're going to show it on the screen. And then after that, we can talk about how you then, after you do this for like a good chunk of time, maybe at least 3 weeks, how you can then go back and assess it and glean some information from it. Okay, so we're going to just start off with day 1. Like I said, we're going to track this for 3 weeks. I'm not going to walk you through all 3 weeks. I'm just going to walk you through a few days that kind of show some significant information. So day 1, she woke up. She went to school. I wrote what she had for a snack. I wrote that she didn't have breakfast. She took a nap after school. I made note of that. And then I wrote down what she had for dinner. And I wrote down that she did some homework, she took a shower, she went to bed, and at what time she fell asleep. One of the reasons it's important to note the food is because food can sometimes play a role in your child's symptoms, and that's something we want to be able to determine. Under symptoms, I wrote that her fatigue that morning, it was present, but it was relatively mild. It was at a 3. Her nausea was also at a 3. So she was nauseous, but she wasn't vomiting. And I'm going to pull up the number scale so I can kind of give you a reference. So a 3 on the fatigue scale is tiredness, makes it hard to enjoy activities. They're usually fun, but they're still able to work or study with some difficulty. So that's where she was at on day 1. And her nausea was relatively mild. She just felt kind of icky, just felt some nausea, but she was still able to eat a little bit. She wasn't vomiting, she wasn't dry heaving. So she had some nausea, fatigue. She also had pain in the soles of her feet. That was at a 4 because we also have a pain scale. It was moderate. She's consistently aware of pain, but she can continue her activities. So that was a 4. She was able to go to school, she was able to walk, but she said that she was aware of it all day. It hurt to walk. And her mood, that's another thing you want to track on the symptoms. Her mood was low. She just seemed withdrawn. And then in my notes, I wrote that she slept through her alarm, extreme difficulty waking up, complained of heaviness in her body, like she can't move. She was tearful, reluctant to go to school. She fell asleep on the couch after snack time and slept through the noise of making dinner. So little details like that can be kind kind of illuminating and let you know that this is not the child's typical behavior. A kid might fall asleep after school, but to sleep through the whole family and the dog barking, that's a little bit unusual. So that was day 1. The next day I have down is day 5. One thing that I did here was I initially wrote that she refused to wake up for school. I crossed that out and I changed it to unable because, again, we're trying really hard to be objective. We're not trying to put our own perceptions and emotions into this, which is really hard when it's your child. So she wasn't refusing to wake up. She was unable to wake up. Like this was not a child that was willfully defiant. That was not her nature. So this was alarming to me that she wouldn't get up to go to school because typically she was, very concerned about her grades and absences. She did wake up finally at 10 a.m., went to school late. She came home at 3. She went straight to bed and she was crying and she fell asleep. She did eat a few bites of dinner. I wrote down what she had for dinner, and then she went to sleep right after dinner. So her symptoms were fatigue, low mood, anxiety, pain, and intrusive thoughts. This was a new one for us, and I didn't even know what it was at the time, but intrusive thoughts are where the child is, or a person, anybody can have them, is thinking of doing something that is scary to them. It's outside of any action they would normally take. It would be maybe hurting somebody, hurting an animal, hurting themselves, and this is something that's out of character for them. That's why it's an intrusive thought. This isn't a compulsion they have. This is something that it's a part of OCD and anxiety. And sometimes people with post-infectious illnesses experience some of these symptoms, and they can be very alarming and scary if you're unaware of what they are. But that's one of the ones she was experiencing. I wrote about in my notes how she not only could she not wake up for school, she couldn't even tell me why she couldn't wake up for school. Her fatigue was so bad that she couldn't even really explain it to me. She was just completely lethargic and drained. I wrote that she was scared about these intrusive thoughts, that they were causing her a lot of anxiety, that she was thinking somewhat violent thoughts. This is a child who wouldn't even kill a bug, that if there's a spider in the house, we have to capture it and put it outside. So this was something very outside of her norm. And that's another thing we want to emphasize is we are comparing, not only are we documenting this for how it's affecting their functionality, we want to also compare it to their baseline. Who is your child? You know your child. Who were they before they got sick, before they had COVID, before they had an infection that started kind of this whole cycle? That's what we're comparing it to. If your child was normally well-behaved, easygoing, and now all of a sudden they seem to be refusing to go to school, refusing to do homework, that's not in my view, that's likely not a behavioral issue. If that's not their norm, there's something else going on. And in the case of post-infectious illnesses, it's more than likely anxiety, fear, fatigue, illness. When we don't feel good, we act out. And that's a very normal thing to do. And especially when you're a child and you don't really know what's going on, it's incredibly scary. So I'm going to go on to day 9. This was a day where she actually felt good. She got up, she ate, she went to school. She even went to swim practice that night. She mentioned that she had to lay down during swim practice during dry land because she was getting out of breath and fatigued. But she was in a good mood and she actually had a really good day that day. I remember at the time thinking, oh, wow, maybe this is over. Maybe whatever this is, we're on the upswing. But then if I go to day 11, 2 days later, she couldn't go to school. Her fatigue was at an 8, which is basically able to sit up for a little while, but not really able to do much else. Even sitting up was taxing for her. On this day, she also mentioned that her heart was racing, her feet were numb, her legs, hands, and arms were numb, and she was very anxious. She was having a lot of shortness of breath. We had an O2 monitor and her oxygen levels were completely normal. So this was really strange. She was like gasping for air as if she couldn't breathe, but her lungs sounded fine and her O2 was normal. So we knew it wasn't an emergency, but it was very scary and very alarming. And she had extreme anxiety and panic attacks on this day. So those are the days that we are going to kind of look at now. And, we're going to pretend as if 3 weeks of documenting these symptoms has passed. And we're going to go back and we're going to look for patterns. What kind of patterns did we see? What things were consistent? What things were the predominant symptoms, and how severe were they? It's not just that somebody has some numbness in their hands and feet. Was it extreme? How long did it last? These are the kind of things that are the observations that matter. Another thing that we want to look at is symptoms that occur together. So if for my daughter, her shortness of breath and the tingling and numbness in her hands and her arms and her legs, sometimes even in her chest and her chin, those always kind of came together. That was a pattern we started to notice. We later figured out that she was diagnosed with dysautonomia, which is something that a lot of people with post-infectious illness experience, and it comes in different forms. And for her, that's how it presented: as shortness of breath, numbness, and racing heart. So when we noticed that all of those things came together, that gave the doctor information to help diagnose her with dysautonomia, which was really helpful, because then we could get her on some medications to stabilize her dysautonomia. So you want to look for patterns, co-occurring symptoms, and you also want to be very aware that with post-infectious illnesses, symptoms come and go. They can be mild one day, severe the next. Your child could have days of seeming normal, and then they come back. In our family, we call it whack-a-mole. As soon as you feel like maybe this has calmed down and we're kind of on the other side of this, another symptom pops up, which is characteristic of post-infectious illnesses. Probably one of the most important things to know is that syndromes are constellations of symptoms. So you are looking at a whole group of symptoms, and sometimes a symptom will happen once, it'll never happen again, new symptoms come in. It's the whole picture. It's not just one thing. You don't diagnose a syndrome by just one symptom. It's all of the symptoms together. So that's one thing we want to understand. And one reason we also look for the patterns is the patterns can tell you if there are triggers. When she had the extreme fatigue to where she could not even wake up for school, that was 2 days after swim practice. Now we know that's post-exertional malaise, which is when you can do an activity, you might be feeling good. A day, 2 days, sometimes even 3 days later, we call them crashes. You crash and symptoms flare. And those flares can last sometimes for a very short time, sometimes for a very long time. So that was a pattern that we started to see, and documenting this helped figure some of this out. Another thing that you want to pay attention to is food. Sometimes food can be a trigger. If you take your child to a friend's birthday party and they eat a ton of cake, they might have some symptoms flare because the sugar can trigger some of these issues that come along with post-infectious illnesses. So the whole exercise is to help you understand what your child's going through, to validate it. That's really important. Anyone who's going through this needs validation from the caretakers in their life, because it's a very isolating feeling when you don't know why your body is doing it, and you don't have a name for it yet, or you don't have a diagnosis, or maybe even some of the doctors aren't sure, maybe they think it's all in your head. It's very isolating. So validating your child's symptoms, that you understand, you hear them, you're paying attention, you believe them. You believe them is the most important thing. So that's part of the exercise, is to validate this, to validate it for yourself too. As parents, we tend to question. We question our children, we question what they do, we question our parenting, we question our judgment. That's all very normal. This helps take some of that out of it. This helps make it very matter of fact and objective, which is exactly what you need. So I hope this helps some of you with trying to kind of get your arms around what is going on with your children, and hopefully bringing some information to your doctor that's going to help get your child a diagnosis and some help for some of the things they're going through. And again, we will have a symptom tracker up on the website. We have resources on the website with other conditions that tend to go along with long COVID and other post-infectious illnesses. But again, I hope this helps, and best of luck to you.